Thank you. So, dynamic archive from the University of the Arts, Bremen. So, we're very happy to be here and for the opportunity to present our project. So, we'll start. Okay. Interview.
How does your process of painting look like? How do you decide what to paint?
Kati.
I am interested in characters, sometimes real and sometimes made up. And then I have these adjectives in mind, thinking about the meaning of these words we apply to certain characters. I wonder, are you sure someone will be interested in this component, my drawings?
Interviewer.
We try to have in mind how one could find it important or inspiring, but more often than not, what happens is nothing we expect. And this is for us even more interesting.
So this was loosely part of the conversation that took place before one of the components was created and entered our archive. And this is the component that ended up online.
One contributor coming from the fine arts decided to share her fragments of work as silhouettes, eyes, and adjectives, as well as an animation. She was very open to the process, but skeptical how one would think it further.
Another contributor from the field of media art took these elements and created a software based on an ancient Chinese divination tool, the I Ching. He programmed different characters that emerged through diverse combinations of the elements from the previous contributor, eyes and silhouettes. And finally, so a text from the I Ching is attached to their description.
Another contributor from design decided to create their own characters and animations, new creators named Qualibots, inspired by the initial offering of eyes and silhouettes. One can tell through the chronology of their contribution which one came first, but they do not really have any hierarchy embedded in them. What has been important here for us is how different knowledge systems connect and create around the same idea viewed from different perspectives in a way we as creators could not foresee.
When they were invited to collaborate in our version room program, they worked on the physical manifestations of their components in the space of a gallery. With Kati showing a video of her animation, Louis created the sculptures that were placed all over the gallery, and Julian created a media installation, an oracle, you can ask questions, and it all started with the silhouette. And so this was a brief introduction into the processes of the dynamic archive through one of more than 200 examples, from harvesting an initial component, an interview with a contributor, to its digital creation, the versions that follow, and the physical manifestations of the digital components in a gallery space.
And this is one of the almost 30 definitions about the dynamic archive in the book we published in 2021. This is a book, we have it with us. You can have a look afterwards inside the book if you want. The dynamic archive is like a bag of peanut flips. Once you start, you can't stop. As it might be apparent by now, the dynamic archive is a tool, is a collection, is a pool, is an instigator, is a technique, is an institution, is a generator of native material. The dynamic archive delegates action, turns rules into carnivalesque spectacle, presents frameworks, celebrates concepts and protocols, enables collaborative structures.
The Dynamic Archive has been an online platform since 2018. The platform compiles artistic and artistic scientific principles, tools, methods, scores, protocols, and notations by artists, designers, and scientists who make them publicly available to other artists, scientists, and cultural institutions for use, to copy, and to expand upon in different versions. New versions created through this type of usage are also uploaded onto the platform and can also initiate new versions or changes in previous components. The platform can also just inspire further ideas. The versions could be, but are not necessarily always published. Transformational processes are inherent elements of the archive and therefore not only map constantly changing practices and infrastructures, but perform them as well. In other words, the archive is continually creating and performing itself. The Dynamic Archive, as an online platform, considers archiving artistic strategies and methods in the age of computation. It works as an artistic research project where the processes, methods, tools, and scores are collected and shared always as possible starting points for further thought and changes, which implies that they are open for any possible non-commercial use. The Dynamic Archive performs a collaborative knowledge production in the arts and as such focuses on the process rather than the preservation of finished works. It thus questions the very notion of preservation in archiving in the digital age. In this context, questions about performativity and the dynamics of an artistic scientific archive in today's knowledge culture have been exemplified and researched in the Dynamic Archive project.
Open source strategies cultivated in software development have served as a model for efforts related to collaborative work, sharing, copying, and further use. Applying the methodology more often found in platforms that focus on processes related to software development, such as forking and branching, the Dynamic Archive began by considering what this method can bring in the context of art, design, and media theory. The art research project focuses mainly on theater and performance, media arts and design, as well as software design, as these fields often apply collaborative and cross-disciplinary working approaches. In this way, the Dynamic Archive encourages the possibility of methods from one field being developed by a practitioner of another, looking for potential in other ways unrelated disciplines. Artists and designers provide the Dynamic Archive in their working methods of processes in order to make these resources available to others for use and further development. Those working methods and processes are referred to as components. The starting point of this research project is the iterative implementation of digital archive itself in the form of web application, thedynamicarchive.net, and the continuous addition of components to the archive. The archive follows for the copy and modification of already archived components. In the context of the Dynamic Archive, those modified copies are referred to as versions. In this respect, the curated platform is as much as a tool as it is a collection.
Once the components and versions are presented beyond their digital environment in the physical space of a program version room, these multidisciplinary principles are contextualized within each different version room and become situated knowledge. As the digital platform moves and performs, its physical manifestations become pockets of stillness where one can linger in the process and knowledge that has been created at that specific point in time and space. In this situation, the collaborators who most probably have not met beyond the digital platform get to connect and collaborate together in the space of the gallery.
Looking into some of the relational processes, the Dynamic Archive could be seen as symbiotic organization: curator, contributor, user, component, version, and physical virtual. To begin with, it collects processes from different contributors through an initial interview process. After first contact, an interview or conversation with the artist or designer is conducted by a member of the Dynamic Archive team. The step serves as a way to discuss and reflect upon the contributors' work methods and processes and how they can be represented as a component in the archive. In this conversation, both sides tried to explore the idea and the method together, with one coming from the position of the platform, the dynamic archive structure and intent, and the other from their own practice, resulting in a new organism known as a component, that in turn changes the archive in its own way. Through their subsequent versions, new processes and collaborations are created. As the components and versions start building on each other, loops are created where it can be unknown which one was created first. The question here is how individually or separately these processes can be perceived, or how separately we want them to appear. Each component and version appear as expressions that are not isolated or disconnected from the other things that exist in the archive. Rather, they are connected or intertwined with them in some way.
In her text on difference without separability, Ferreira da Silva questions the notion of the other. The other, she writes, can be understood as something that is different or distinct from oneself or one's own group. She suggests thinking of these expressions or entities not as separate from one another or from the larger system in which they exist, but as being inextricably connected to each other and to the whole. This idea challenges the traditional notion of the other as something that is fundamentally distinct or separate from oneself. Therefore, we suggest that it challenges the very principles of symbiosis. Symbiosis, by definition, considers physical contact and the changes that emerge through this contact. When we then think of digital processes, on one hand, the complexity of the code defining them, and on the other, the overwhelming presence of vast data, is it even possible to think of separate entities and their merging behaviors in any controlled way? The immateriality or virtuality are not visible or tangible. In the context of digital archives, this relation of physical as separate and virtual as non-local can be considered through symbiotic infrastructures generated through and as the archive, and at the same time as a collection of scores, protocols, notations, and software.
Is it going? It's a link that it's supposed to lead to.
Okay.
We want to show.
What to what?
Want it to the archive online.
You want to open a web page?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry.
Yeah, it's just a short conclusion after this.
Sure.
Well, okay. Yeah.
Oh, I guess we should screen that.
So now you can see the online platform. If you go to the search option, there are some suggestions offered, but you can as well search for any word that's interesting to you.
So the dynamic archive can be seen as artistic investigations at the boundaries of the archives, and as such, it questions the standard that an archive implies. As a structure in constant motion that considers itself a starting point for further development, the dynamic archive works as an online platform and a physical space. Within this complex reality of physical and virtual, it recurses the possibility of unknown, accepting the experiment as its intent. To imagine the archive as something different from an orderly whole, consisting of separate components that relate through some sort of measurement, we must accept the uncertainty of its result and stay focused in rehearsing this uncertainty. In embracing the nature of uncertain process lies perhaps only the position of the dynamic project.
The only position of this dynamic project. Thank
Thank
you.
you.